Decade of African Descent as an initiative by the United Nations to really highlight the people of African descent throughout the globe, looking at our history, our current realities, our accomplishments, and really advocate for the fulfillment of our full human rights. Focusing on people of African descent if we want to get anything close to an equal level playing field. So for me, it makes sense to renew the decade, and hopefully this will lead to a century of looking at people of African descent.
Hello, everyone, and we welcome you to this very special edition of the Bubb Report on a Tuesday. And the Bubb Report is honored to be hosting this public forum on the United Nations Declaration of the Second Decade of People of African Descent. Now, the Second International Decade for People of African Descent was proclaimed on the 17th of December, 2024. This second international decade is an opportunity to take concrete actions to confront the legacies of enslavement and colonization, to deliver reparatory justice, and secure the full human rights and freedoms of people of African descent worldwide. The first international decade, while a significant milestone, fell short in delivering transformative change, according to several experts on the human rights of people of African descent. Barbara Reynolds, chair of the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent, said that the initial effort increased awareness of anti-Black racism and the human rights of people of African descent, but lacked enough political support and political will and investment from member states. In this afternoon's webinar, the Bubb Report is pleased to host this public education forum on the second decade of people of African descent. Now, joining us for this conversation are Ms. Ganelle Curry, Chair of the United Nations Permanent Forum on People of African Descent and Head of the Law Department and Assistant Professor of Law at the University of the Bahamas. We welcome Ms. Curry. We're also joined by Dr. June Suma, a member of the United Nations Permanent Forum of People of African Descent, a member of the St. Lucia Reparations Committee, also a member of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, and also a member of the African Union Committee on Reparations. We welcome Dr. Suma to this very important public forum. And we're also joined by Dr. Bright Gamfi. If I do apologize in advance, and you will correct me, but you are a Ghanaian-born assistant professor of history at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey. He currently serves as an acting president of the Ghana Studies Association and sits on the boards of directors of the West African Research Association and the Oxford and Cambridge Societies of Ghana, respectively. We also later will be joined by Mr. Ali Gill, who serves as the chairman of Grenada's National Reparations Commission and a member of the CARICOM Reparations Commission. We intend to have him later for this forum. I am your host, Dr. Kellen Bubb, Associate Professor of Communications, Culture, and Media Studies at Montgomery College in the United States in Maryland, and I'm also a scholar, investigative journalist, writer, and the host of the Bubb Report. Now, listeners may or may not be familiar panels. First and foremost, welcome to this very important forum.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Now, we want to begin this conversation by talking about the importance of the second decade. Not all people will be familiar with the United Nations. Some may or may not be. But could you first explain the structure and role of the United Nations? And we want to begin by having a conversation with Ms. Curry on this, especially as it functions in the context of the Caribbean, in the OECS, and the wider Caribbean. And that will be the first part of the question. And the second part of the question is I'm hoping that you can explain the UN's role in establishing this international decade, or the second decade at least, for people of African descent?
Thank you so much for having me and for the excellent question. It's a pleasure to be
Yes.
here. I do believe that, well, the question I would say is a rather wide one. So when we talk about the UN, we understand that the UN is quite a vast body and is made up of many different aspects. So when we speak of the UN, we have a tendency to speak of the UN as a whole, but it really involves several different aspects. So we have, as we know, and I don't want to go through a long history lesson here, but we have three main pillars in the UN. One dealing with peace and security, which of course is the Security Council. One dealing with sort of more political development issues. And that's the General Assembly, the ECOSOC, and well, the Economic Council, and many of the specialized agencies. And then you have a human rights arm as the third arm. It's the smallest one, although in my opinion it should be much larger, but it's the third arm and the third pillar of the Permanent Forum. And I will say that issues around anti-racism or anti-Black racism have been on the agenda of the UN, or have been around in the UN since its inception, because we talk even in the charter itself, it speaks about non-discrimination based on race and color, etc. So it was there an awareness, and we know that we had through more the UN human rights aspect, so that human rights pillar, we began to develop a little bit more this issue around what does it mean when we talk about anti-racism. And we had CERD, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the first agreed human rights treaty where states were signing on, in many Caribbean countries, all of them actually ratified and joined into and signed on to the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Of course, this was important to Caribbean countries, having gone through our history of enslavement and colonialism. So this is something that we took on quite early, and we were members of the CERD, or states parties to the CERD Convention, very early on. And of course, we had, following CERD, we also had a special rapporteur as early as 1993. And of course, then we had really a big leap in terms of making the connection between anti-racism or systemic racism and colonialism, and describing what we now call the gravest crime against humanity. And we had, of course, Durban speaking about that. So when we talk about how it evolved in the UN, we can see that much of that work has gone through the human rights part of it, although there are some elements that take place in other aspects of this. We had most recently, for an example, in the General Assembly, a big discussion around recognizing the transatlantic traffic of enslaved Africans in the General Assembly, raised and led by Ghana, and reiterating what was said already in Durban in 2001, that enslavement and the trafficking of enslaved Africans was, in fact, and remains a crime against humanity. So the history is well linked from the time of the inception of the UN to today. And we've seen many mechanisms that emerged since then. Within the human rights context, we have a number of specialized bodies. The one that, of course, is most dear to myself and Dr. Suma is the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. And all of this really came out of Durban. And we have the setup of the Permanent Forum. We have the setup of a special unit looking at policing racism and policing, the EMLA. We have, of course, a working group, and we heard from the former chair just a few minutes ago on your clip. And all of these are mechanisms that have emerged. And we heard about the decade. We are now in the second decade, but there are other mechanisms. I think we need to pay particular focus to Durban, to the decade, first and second, and we're in the second already. We know what those are. We need to pay particular attention to the issues around data, which is the third D that the Permanent Forum looks at. And we need to look lastly at the development of a declaration on human rights of people of African descent. So all of this is happening within the UN context. And so when we speak about what has the UN done, it has done a lot. And so there's a massive body of work that we can build on. And Caribbean countries have been very much involved, as I said. ratifying treaties, also leading, I would say, leading in a very significant way, co-leading really the recent Ghana led resolution, leading in terms of his work on reparations, being far ahead of many of the other jurisdictions in terms of how we conceptualize issues around reparations and anti-Black racism and on all of it. So Caribbean countries have been, as I said, reporting and raising the flag, even when we had discussions around apartheid. All right. That was really significantly led by Caribbean countries. My own government, the Bahamas, I know our former prime minister was deep into that discussion of how do we ensure that we address issues around apartheid, anti-racism, anti-discrimination. And the sentiment is still the same in the Bahamas. I recently had a discussion with my own leaders where their focus is around how do we continue to address racism and xenophobia in the region. So we recognize that the UN has an important role to play, but we have to ensure that all these processes work together and they come together in a comprehensive and a cohesive way so that we have a movement forward that addresses systemic racism and accountability around reparations and what that means in all aspects of the work that are important to us in the Caribbean. For an example, climate change. I'll stop there. There's a lot more to say, but I'll give others a chance.
Yes, absolutely. Dr. Suma, I'm hoping that you can chime in here to speak to, of course, you sit on several committees, but we want to go on to have a conversation about the importance of having a second decade. And first and foremost, the importance, first and foremost, of the UN initially recognizing a decade of people of African descent, following what occurred in Durban as well, and following the recent declarations that we had at the UN with respect to recognizing the graveness of slavery as such a crime against humanity.
Thank you so much for your kind invitation. GNL has laid a very solid foundation with regard to the second decade and why we are looking for a second decade. But I want to start where she ended, with regard to the Permanent Forum itself and its role. I believe that it is the first time that you are witnessing such a consultative platform for people of African descent at the United Nations. So while the United Nations has done all of these things that she has spoken to, it has now given ordinary people access to the United Nations through the Permanent Forum for us to look at the issues that Barbara raised around recognition, around justice, and around development. And at the heart of all of these issues are the human rights issues that we spoke to, and the fact that we have to recognize the contributions and the challenges that have been faced by people of African descent. For me, the second decade, and I was at the heart of the discussions on the second decade, I was the chair at the time, and there was a lot of resistance to a second decade for people of African descent. Even if the first decade did not achieve the things that we wanted it to achieve in terms of transformation, in terms of tackling systemic racism, in relation to structural racism, and so on. All of these things remained in place throughout the first decade. And we heard from Barbara, it was because of the lack of political will. Yes, she put it in terms of finance, but that finance could have been achieved if there was political will to do it. And I mean, even in our own countries, because we spoke to the issue of decolonization, and our countries have assumed a posture that because we have achieved independence, we have become decolonized, which is not so. And the recent attacks on our sovereignty prove to us that unless we transform systems, we cannot just pay lip service. We have to transform systems. Then we cannot tackle the issues that we need to transform during the second decade. And I am telling you again that given that resistance to having a second decade, we are not going to get a third decade. So the young lady who spoke about 400 years for people of African descent, we will have to seize that moment ourselves. You know, there's a phrase going around the Caribbean these days that from Professor Robinson of the UWI, that no one is coming to save us. We have to save ourselves. That is, there's nothing more true than that. We have to save ourselves. And we have a second decade to undertake the transformations internally that we want to see and tackle them globally also if we want to see transformation and a restructuring that we want, and the 10-point plan points to that. Because I will also tell you, out of abundance of caution, but because we have taken such a bold step very early in this year with the passing of that declaration of the enslavement of Africans and the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans as the gravest crime against humanity, that we have reached the point where we can see a number of things coming together. First of all, last year, at the beginning of the second decade, the African Union declared a year for reparatory justice for Africans and people of African descent. So that was very critical. And this year, they have extended it to a decade. So when we were fighting at the UN for the second decade to be named as the decade for reparatory justice, and there was resistance at that level, we ourselves have taken the steps to ensure that the 21st century is the century for reparatory justice. And so these are the issues I think that we'll be raising tonight on how we make this a decade for reparatory justice to achieve the enlightenment that CARICOM is looking for.
And absolutely, Professor, and again, forgive me, please correct me. How do we pronounce your name, sir? Let me get it correctly.
Jemfi.
Professor Jemfi.
Yes.
Jemfi,
yes.
very well, very well. Thank you so much. Now, Professor, I want to get you in on this conversation with respect to understanding the significance of the second decade for people of African descent in the motherland. Obviously, the transatlantic slave trade originated from the motherland. I had the opportunity to visit Ghana, and it was a spiritual and heart-wrenching visit for me. But could you talk about the significance for the second decade for not only us as people of African descent, but for our cousins, if you will, on the continent?
For sure. By the way, greetings from Ghana. I'm currently in Ghana at the moment.
Very well. Yes.
So as a historian, I think it's very important to understand the foundations of the United Nations, right? As an entity being born in 1945, October in 1945, when Europe lied in ruins. Europe had colonized Africa on the premise that it was going to civilize these barbaric, primitive peoples. And yet, Africans standing in Europe fighting for quote unquote freedom, which is not theirs, began to ask the question, how can a group of people brutalize each other, kill each other in such a way, have monopoly over quote civilization? So the United Nations as an entity was supposed to envision a world of peace where something like World War II could not transpire anymore. But while this was happening, we have to take into account that same October 1945 in Manchester, you have the Fifth Pan-African Congress. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Du Bois of the United States, as well as George Padmore of Trinidad and Tobago, among other Africans, African Americans, thinking about world making after empire. How do we create and imagine a new world for ourselves beyond what colonization had defined for us. So, in a way, they worked within the United Nations, at the same time reminded us of the importance of working outside of institutions that did not account for Africans as being humans. And I think that is very, very crucial and important for us to know. So when we think through the second decade of Africa, the second decade for people of African descent, it is critical that we think about it as a global endeavor, that Africans and people of African descent in joint communication trying to articulate to the world and make demands that African peoples have to assert their right and remind the world that the modern world was built on the exploitation of Black people. And hence, we have to push and make demands for reparations.
Very important. If I can just ask a quick follow-up question before we get on to the other agenda item. We have seen a push now for reparations on the continent as well. The Caribbean, there has always been that advocacy there. Can you talk about, in the context of the second decade, how important reparations is for Africans on the continent?
So, to make two quick points about the reparations. So sometimes people forget that there were enslaved Africans who did not make it to the Americas, but then still very much suffered significantly. So when we think about reparations, we also have to think about those communities as well. And then secondly, with the expansion of reparations, Walter Rodney and others have invited us to think about, Nkrumah himself with his book, Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, that Europe continued to advance, to build, to acquire wealth based on the constant exploitation of African peoples and their resources. Even today, when we speak, most of French West Africa are still paying colonial taxes to access their own money. It makes no sense. When we think about these schools that emerge in West Africa, people do not associate it with the constant exploitation that is still going on, right? A new form of neocolonialism, one can argue. So for Africans, it is about making sure that the colonial enterprise that Africans experience, that extracted their physical wealth, intellectual wealth, are also accounted. So that is why Ghana, along with other African countries, are building on the work that CARICOM has started and leading the way on that particular front.
Very well. Now let's go on. I'm going to bring you back, Ms. Curry, and also Dr. Suma as well. And could you share, Ms. Curry? I'll start with you on this one. Could you share the history of the UN's recognition, and you touched on it earlier, but the recognition of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery as crimes against humanity? That was a significant red letter day, if you will, at the United Nations. I was very proud of that moment, that it got that recognition that it finally deserved. But what were the key developments following the 2001 World Conference Against Racism, as well as the Durban Declaration and Program of Action? And I suppose all of those led up to this moment that we had recently. So could you talk about the work that was done to get us to this point?
Yes. Go ahead. Go ahead, Jim.
Yes. Yes.
I just want us to get it right from the beginning, because people are listening to us. That the resolution that was passed in May dealt with racialized chattel enslavement. So we have to get the language right.
Yeah.
Racialized chattel enslavement and the trafficking of enslaved Africans as the gravest, not the greatest, the gravest crime against humanity. And Gaynell, I'm sorry to interrupt. I mean,
No,
No,
go
no, no.
ahead.
It's
That's fine.
that's an important intervention. Yes.
because
Hmm.
you have to understand why it is called the gravest crime against humanity. People have knocked that language. People have voted or abstained because of that language, simply because they do not understand why we are saying it's the gravest crime against humanity. When we were declared as chattel by the 1661 Barbados Code, it was the first time in history that people who were called slaves were then turned into property. Before that, you could not inherit, buy, sell a human being. So it was the turning point in humanity when a human being could be declared as somebody else's property. And that turning point set the relationship on which white supremacy is built. And we have to acknowledge that from the onset for us to understand the importance of that declaration. I'm so sorry, Ginel, to
No, no,
No,
interrupt.
no.
not at all.
Don't apologize at all. I think the language is important. Yes. So thank
That,
you for
that
that
absolutely
intervention.
needed to be said. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you so much, June. That absolutely needed to be said.
Yes.
And I think it's important that we understand that the issue of crimes against humanity and enslavement of Africans and the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans is something that was mentioned at Durban in 2001,
Hmm.
right? So they mentioned at that time, they included at that time um, enslavement and the transatlantic trafficking of African and enslavement of Africans
Hmm.
was a crime against humanity, one of many. And of course, we have the Rome Statute that elaborates a number of other crimes against humanities, right? Humanity. So we want to be clear that this is not the first time we're talking about enslavement as a crime against humanity. And June rightly said it. We needed to show just how grave this matter was, because it's not, or is, it is not just simply a crime, but it is the dehumanization of Black people as people, and that whole chattelization of enslaved Africans is what made that difference. Which is why I think this resolution that came about this year was so very important to bring home. And initially, I will say that the forum and us in the Caribbean, we've been very much involved in this whole the elaboration of it, the discussion of it, the negotiation of it. We've been very much involved. And I will say that being a part of that drafting of that resolution, that's one of the things that our dear sister, Vereen Shepherd from Jamaica, hammered home. The issue of language, the same language that Dr. Suma just spoke about. And it was so important that we had her in the room at the time because she insisted that we get the language right. And I think CARICOM has, and Caribbean countries, but because of work that we've done on reparations, on understanding this issue and fleshing it out over the years, we were so much more evolved in how we were even using the language to speak about this issue. So I think it is really very crucial that we understand that we were part of this process, that we were heavily engaged in it at the very inception in discussing it. I think Varian and I were in the first round of discussions. Dr. Suma and others were in the second round. And so we've been through several iterations where Caribbean colleagues who are experts are in the room on this issue. And I think it's important for us to remember that. So Durban is where we first thought about or came up with this idea around enslavement being a crime against humanity. And we said then, I think at Durban, the first time that direct connection was made between enslavement, colonialism, and systemic racism that we face even today, and persistent underdevelopment in many countries. And that direct line we have seen drawn, an example, directly to Haiti and some of the challenges that our Haitian brothers and sisters have faced since their revolution, since winning their revolution in 1804. And that sort of direct line needed to be said, that understanding what happened and why it is the gravest crime against humanity was really very important. And I think this new resolution, for me, it's another step, right? It's an important step, but we have to be sure that this step is building on a lot of the foundational work that has already been done in a number of spaces. CARICOM, certainly for sure, with its 10-point plan and the commission, and of course throughout the Caribbean, the committees, which are doing important work at the national level. That work has to be brought into it and cannot be left aside, which is why it's important that we have a close collaboration with Ghana as they lead on this issue in the African Union. I think it's important that we also have, when we think about the importance of this resolution, this new resolution, is that we must see how we can use existing mechanisms such as the permanent forum. And when I was in Ghana, I said this: let's not pretend that these processes don't exist. How can we use these processes in the next steps as we think about what follows that resolution? Because yes, we had 123 countries agreeing, and that was so tremendous and such a historic occasion, an opportunity for us as people of African descent to move this agenda forward. But I think it's going to be important, several things, and I want to get these in quickly, that we ensure that we connect with existing processes and frameworks that are there. How can we ensure that they are part of the process? How can we ensure that we don't have an exclusively top-down approach, that we bring in the grassroots? You can think of the Rastafarians in my country and across the Caribbean who've been speaking about this issue for many, many years. We cannot have a process that forgets them. We also have to ensure that we have a conversation that brings in issues that are also important to us in the region. For example, the climate framework. How do we make that connection? How do we ensure that we have youth central to the discussion? Because this is an intergenerational discussion. It is something that happened in the past. It is what we experience in today. And how will future generations of people of African descent benefit from this? And how do we ensure that everyone is around the table, even those persons that abstained? And they were primarily the enslavers. And so we have to find a way to have a conversation with them. So I think following Durban, on the program of action, a lot has happened within the UN system, and I mentioned them already. We have a number of processes, but where we're at right now is we have to think about transformation, and that transformation must involve as many people as possible. We have to recognize people's realities are different. And so Blacks in Brazil are having a different reality of Blacks in Haiti, and those in the Bahamas, and those in Canada. And June and I were in Canada early in the year, and there are real concerns throughout the United States and other parts, in Costa Rica and Colombia. We've been to these places where we see their challenge. How do we ensure that we connect the Caribbean process and this new African agenda on the next steps from the resolution? How do we ensure that we have that connection that brings together everyone so that we move forward to transform the lives of people of African descent, the human rights, the lives and livelihoods of people of African descent throughout must be addressed. And we cannot forget our brothers and sisters also in Europe, because they're also, as we know from this recent incidents in football, how much racism they're actually facing. So I would say that much has happened since the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, and there's much more work to be done. We're well on our way, and I'm very happy about that.
Dr. Suma, is there anything else you wish to add to what was just said?
Yes, I can add many things.
Yes.
I want to start by adding that enough recognition is not given to the CARICOM process.
Yeah.
For you to understand the leadership role that we have assumed in the process. First of all, at the United Nations, you have Vereen Shepherd, who is on the third. You have Gaynell Curry and I, who are on the permanent forum of people of African descent, the only region that has 2 people representing on the permanent forum out of the 10 people, or the 10 experts. Then you have to understand that you had Barbara Reynolds on earlier, who is also on the working group. So you have a core group of women who are at the heart of raising issues around the humanity of people of African descent.
Mhm.
Then you have the CARICOM 10-point plan, which we have reworked. I sat on that committee also. We have reworked to call it a manifesto for enlightenment, because we recognize that colonialism is something that has been phased. It's different phases. So you had the phase of genocide, where they destroy the indigenous people, and our manifesto addresses how you deal with indigenous people and their development. So we are not looking only at enslaved Africans. We're also looking at the indigenous people. Then we look at enslaved Africans and all of the legacies that have followed that Gaynell has mentioned, including the
Mhm.
fact that we have right now in the manifesto ensured that the place of women is very clear. Because when you talk about the broad sweep called enslavement, you have to recognize that women of African descent have a special place, and we have to advocate for reparatory justice for women of African descent
Mhm.
because of the fact that we have been so oppressed that we remain the bottom of all statistics right now: social, economic, political, etc. Women of African descent are at the bottom of all statistics currently.
Mhm.
And you
Mhm.
understand the destruction of our image, the destruction of our bodies, etc. And then the other phase, the phase or the colonial phase, that included almost like enslavement contracts for other people in the region, like the indentured servants. So we have
Mhm.
recognized that colonialism is phased. Earlier, we heard about neocolonialism. I'm one of those people who do not subscribe to that. Colonialism in any phase is colonialism. And in the Caribbean, we still have 20 colonial
Yep.
entities. We
Mm-hmm.
have countries that have disappeared from our region because they have now been absorbed into a European configuration. Let's take Bonaire, for example. Bonaire
Mm-hmm.
is now considered a province in the Netherlands. You know,
Yeah.
our Caribbean Sea is divided between the independent countries, the United States, the French, the British, the um
Dutch.
the Dutch.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we have
Mhm.
that so we still have colonialism, and for us colonialism must be removed. There must be that structural transformation to make sure that all peoples of the Caribbean are free. So
Mhm.
you
Mhm.
have to center the Caribbean in the global discourse, and how we have ensured, now that we have moved to the next phase of engaging with the continent, to
Mhm.
make sure that we recognize the connection. We realized in the Caribbean that we needed that connection. We have been traumatized by a criminal system that if we do not now reconnect with our brothers and sisters on the continent, and I'm so glad they have jumped in with us through the
Mm-hmm.
CARICOM, the joint CARICOM AU meetings, that we are moving together, and that unity is making many people afraid.
Solidarity and unity among peoples of African descent is absolutely so critical. So, Professor, I would jump. You're over in Ghana. Can you talk about, in the context of again getting the continent on board with a lot of the efforts of your cousins in the Caribbean, in North America, in Europe, in
Yeah.
South America, and places where we are all located now?
So, I mean, first of all, I definitely want to echo the important leadership of CARICOM in leading this charge. And I think it's very crucial. Although Ghana brought it to the UN, we have to understand that it was a collective effort that especially CARICOM has been building for many, many years. But at the same time, to the African Union, before it became the African Union, the Organization of African Unity had also taken steps. In 1993, in Abuja, there was the Abuja Declaration, right? That brought attention to reparation for African enslavement, colonization, and the language that they used was also neo-colonialism. And they talked about the importance of reminding the world that, quote, the damage sustained by the African peoples is not a thing of the past. It is painfully manifested in the damaged lives of contemporary Africans from Harlem to Harare, in the damaged economies of the Black world from Guinea to Guyana, from Somalia to Suriname. So there is this long tradition. And what I like about what is happening now is how we are consolidating our efforts to bring these things as a collective agenda between the CARICOM, AU, to remind people of the lived experience, the global exploitation upon which Black people's lives, labor were built. So the AU also thinking through these things. Ghana recently in December organized the Africa Summit, which brought together folks from the Caribbean as well as African countries to have these conversations as to how can we join forces, right? And today, even recently, Ghana, during the hurricane that happened, Ghana sent about a couple of, about 100 or so soldiers to go to Jamaica to help rebuild the country. And a few days ago, they are also sending teachers to go to Barbados to also assist in that. So we are moving from just conversation to real partnership, solidarity on the ground. And this is very, very important as we think about the next decade, what the next decade for the Black African world is going to look like.
Mm-hmm. And that solidarity piece, Gaynell, you wanted to add, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that the Ghanaian teachers are also going to be coming to the Bahamas, I understand. I heard on the news today.
Yes.
So awesome. The collaboration continues.
Yes.
Yes,
300
yes.
And nurses, yeah.
Yes.
And I want to add that we have recognized that a long time ago in the African Union, because we keep saying Ghana, and Ghana is the champion for the African Union.
Yes.
But I also sit on the African Union Committee of Experts on Reparations, representing the Permanent Forum on that body. But I sit also on the executive of that body, representing both the Permanent Forum and CARICOM. So we have recognized on the continent that it is very important for us to be, for the Caribbean, for the Permanent Forum, which represents all people of African descent, to be at the heart of the conversation also on the continent.
Yes.
Also, and that is very important. We are not being left out at the level of the continent. So when I go to represent the Permanent Forum on that body, I am representing a much wider group of people called the diaspora. And because CARICOM has been at the center of these discussions, they ensured that a CARICOM person was on the executive. So Africa is looking, and the African Union is looking at reparatory justice for everybody. For everybody. And so the framework that we will develop for them, which includes consultations with people on the continent, will ensure that whatever we eventually come out with after these consultations will be very representative of not simply what we want to see happen at the United Nations, but what we want to see amongst ourselves in dealing with our healing, our trauma, our reconnection, etc. And I think that is very important for us to put on the table.
It's very, very crucial. Oh, sorry. Oh.
No, you go ahead, please. Go ahead. Yes, just go ahead. You wanted to add.
So I was going to say that the solidarity is very important, because even when Ghana gained independence, you had a number of African Americans, Caribbeans who moved to Ghana to help with the nation building process. And when Caribbean countries were also gaining independence, the same thing happened, right? So what we are now trying to build in these modern times is actually there's a long history to this solidarity, right? Where we are moving beyond the dependency of Europe to bring, quote unquote, their know-how, their skills, and bypassing that to see how can we build with each other? How can we learn along with each other? So I was so excited when, even a couple of years ago, Ghana signed a free visa between Ghana and Jamaica, right? And we are hoping other countries follow suit, as well as more flights between our various regions, because that
That
is
we
how we
need.
begin to advocate. That's how we begin to create political alliances, economic alliances, and consciousness. That's one thing I
Yeah,
wanted to.
I think that human to human connection is
Mhm.
absolutely critical, because I make the point that when issues of direct flights between the continent and the Caribbean comes up, people are again asking themselves, well, how will that happen logistically? And in my mind, I'm saying, well, how did these human traffickers uh, forcibly carry us across the Atlantic Ocean logistically? If they can
Exactly.
do it that way, we can do it
Yeah.
positively in reverse. Yes,
Hmm.
so
Hmm.
I think that is an absolutely critical point, because again, we've been so colonized into thinking that all connection has to go through
Europe and
the
America.
colonized spaces, the colonizing
Hmm.
spaces,
Hmm.
when no, they relied on our connections, they relied
Yeah.
on our roots for their profit. So therefore,
Yeah.
it's our opportunity now to rely on our roots, to reclaim those roots.
Hmm.
Yes,
Yes.
that they use for the purposes of subjugation, genocide, and exploitation, to
Hmm.
be able to again have that restorative justice and that healing, and that empowerment, people to people empowerment, that we need. But I just thought it was important to add. Ganel, you wanted to add something else as well, so I'll give you that chance now.
Actually, I mean, not to prolong the process, but I think it's really crucial that we think about how we're engaging in every day. One of the things that we have been trying to do here in the Bahamas, for an example, as I mentioned, to all teachers and also nurses. But how do we deal with the Africa XM Bank? How do we do more connections in trade and business and
Yes.
investments? How do we strengthen each other's economies? When others are shutting us out, how can we ensure that our connections with Africa is stronger? I want to put a quick point here that we're trying very hard, it's still a work in progress, to see that the permanent forum can have its next session. I want to put this in here as we talk about cooperation, collaboration, and bringing
Yeah.
diaspora hopefully to Africa. We are hoping to have our next session, which will be in April 2027, in Addis, and so at the AU. So we're hoping that we can bring a large delegation of persons from the diaspora into Africa and have a big conclave discussing issues. Because as June mentioned already, the forum is the largest platform right now where people of voices of African descent come together and speak. And it's civil society primarily. It's not government led. Many of the other mechanisms within the UN are really primarily sort of government. So when we talk about CERD and others, that reports of governments coming to the committees, what we do at the forum is we have a platform for civil society to come and speak to us and with us, and to each other, really, and to build that network. And we can have anywhere from 800 to 1,000 people in the room, and online a few hundred more. So we're talking about large gatherings of people of African descent. And this will be an opportunity for us to now gather on the continent for the first time and to have a real engagement. And I would love to see, this is just my thought, and we talked about it briefly at the last session, to have a coming together of African youth and youth in the diaspora to really speak about their vision, and how they see this playing out for them in terms of addressing the issues that are important to us, and also when we think about issues around reparations, when we think about issues around development, when we think about issues of the digital and AI processes as we are part of. How do we see that coming together for our youth, and in terms of bridging that gap that we have between Africa and the diaspora, which we are already doing, but how do we strengthen that? and how do we bring together those issues that are really important to both us in the sixth region and also the continent on the continent as well. So just wanted to put a plug in there while I remember. We're going to be in Addis next year. So want as many people as possible to start thinking about joining us there.
And what? Yes, go ahead, Dr. Suma.
Yes, I want to make to reiterate what Gaynell said, but to emphasize that there are two fundamental points that will be important when we go to Addis in relation to the second decade.
Mm-hmm.
The first one is financing. Remember, we already said that there was inadequate financing of the first decade. We want commitments from
Yes.
government for the
Yeah.
second decade on financing. I can tell you that the permanent forum is very poorly financed. We are
Very
only
important.
allowed to have one session per year, and they're already trying to cut the number of days that we are having for our session. So they find that we have been too successful, and so they want to start to silence us. That is part of the erasure that you are seeing globally now. So we have to ensure that the financing is in place. The other thing that will be very important because it's fundamental to statistics and data collection is the issue of monitoring and evaluation.
Yeah.
The permanent forum was established very late, although it was established to monitor the first decade. We have certain targets that we have to meet. We want to ensure that in the second decade that all countries have these in place so that we can monitor, we can go in and say you did not put in place the targets to do with, for example, changing of laws
Mm-hmm.
with regard to how you treat immigrants, to how you relate to women of African descent. We must have an accountability system for the second decade that we did not have in the first decade. And it will be very important. And it is something that we must really bring home in Addis so that our young people can advocate for it, so that all people on the continent must advocate for accountability from these former, well, I don't even want to call them former colonizers, but I said because they are still
They're still
colonizers,
current.
You're still
Yeah.
colonizers, yeah. Yeah.
colonizers, and from ourselves also. Because yes, we speak to the issue of reparatory justice, but we also need to look at our internal healing, how we treat each other, how we deal with perceptions of the continent. There for
Yeah.
years they have referred to Africa as the dark continent, you know, or as a as I don't want to put these words on the air, but as a backward
Yeah.
continent.
And I'm glad you raised that because even our own people have internalized a lot of these black anti-African biases from the
Yes.
colonizers, so much so that we some of our people are perpetuating and reproducing a lot of
Yes.
these colonial era tropes.
Yes,
Yes.
take the issue of corruption. You know, globally now corruption has a black face, but we're seeing what's
Exactly.
happening in the World Cup, and we are not the overseers.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have never been the overseers, you
Mhm.
know, and the plantation owners. I mean, football is like another plantation,
Yes.
you know. So
That
I
is a
am
whole other
saying
conversation.
that's another conversation, but I am
Yes,
saying that
a very important one. Yes, go ahead.
but I am saying that it is important for us to break down the stereotypes of the continent and of people of African descent and of Africans as backward people. You came in and you stole our technology, you stole our innovations, and you have claimed them for your own. You have put in place systems to make sure that we cannot collect royalties on our own innovations, you know. So I am saying that we have to recognize that we have a big educational program ahead of us to be able to educate each other with regard to our achievements and our contributions to humanity, because the first thing they will say to you is, what have Africans contributed to humanity? And they forget that we civilized them.
I would say water, water, soap and water. I'm just gonna put that out
Yes,
there.
say that. Yes, you can say that. I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah, just putting that out there. But let us go on again in respect of and you, some of you have touched on this in respect of the pushback that you receive. The modern term that is used now is gaslighting. That whenever reparative justice advocates call for reparations, or even in the context of that recent UN declaration as enslavement is a crime, a grave crime against humanity, you see that pushback, you see that gaslight, right? We know, for example, that the CARICOM Reparations Committee, they in the 10-point declaration, they asserted the role that Europe played as owners and traders of enslaved Africans, who they instructed genocidal actions upon, for example, the indigenous communities. You raise the indigenous communities, and I think sometimes that is missing in those mainstream conversations, because nobody wants to talk about the genocide of the native peoples. I mean, we acknowledge it as conscious people, but the genocide of the indigenous people that existed here, who were not discovered. You cannot discover people who had civilizations before yours here that lived in these parts, right? And so let us talk about, first and foremost, we know about the CARICOM Reparations Commission's 10-point plan for reparatory justice. Let us talk about, and if the panel can share about the challenges to achieving reparatory justice. That has been a challenge for the CARICOM Commission. But let us talk about, and I will begin with you, Ms. Curry, on this question, the role that the UN can play in supporting and facilitating efforts for CARICOM and for the continent as well, on efforts for facilitating reparatory justice.
Thank you. And I will say that the Permanent Forum, let's start there,
Yes,
has been very intentional about addressing issues around reparatory justice. And every year, we've met 5 years so far, we've had 5 sessions so far. And in each of those sessions, we have been very specifically addressing reparatory justice. And so we have thematic issues every year, but we've said consistently that reparatory justice will be on the agenda every year. So we already have decided that this is going to be something that the Permanent Forum will always move forward on, will always try to center, will always try to push. And in this decade, it's going to be really a big push for us to move on that. So the Permanent Forum has already come up with a number of recommendations in its work over the last few years, the last 5 years. We talked about, and June mentioned funding. We talked about setting up a fund, and what would that fund look like? Because we know that there needs to be some sort of funding, a global reparatory fund for us to look at these issues. So we have about, I would say, 4 or 5 recommendations. I'll try to list a couple of them. And so we also talk about setting up an independent commission within the UN to study this issue further. And we know that a lot of work has been done, but to look at how do we take the next steps? Where do we take the next steps? How do we ensure that there is solidarity, if you will, between the different almost silos of work? How do we bring it all together? And we've talked about developing sort of that legal side of it. So grounding our work in international law, what existed, what do we want to see from a legal perspective in this work? And we've talked also about setting up mechanisms, institutions within the UN system to address reparatory justice claims and to recommend concrete measures to move this process forward. So we've come up with a number of recommendations, and I mean, I said to my colleagues in Ghana that I think we're on the right track, because the next steps conference in Ghana, some of these very issues came up. The fund came up as an important part of it. Having strategic leadership, right, to move the process forward. These are some of the things that we've already talked about, which is why I said early on in my discussion, there needs to be an opportunity for us to see what is existing, for us to build on what is there already. We know that CERD, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, is also within the process of finalizing its general recommendation on reparatory justice. How can that feed into the process? We know that the working group, and we heard from Barbara earlier on, has done a lot of work in this area. So we need to think about what exists already within the UN system, and quite a lot of work has been done, even in places like UNESCO, where we've talked about the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved persons. So there's a lot of work in the UN system already existing, and that work will continue. Now, Joan just mentioned that there is an effort to perhaps silence some of this work, and I think one of the spaces where there is an effort to, I would say, rationalize maybe the work, in my view, quiet the voices of the masses on this issue, is with the Permanent Forum. So we have to ensure that the Permanent Forum can be maintained. I want to say that when we in our last session, we heard from certain groups. It was if you listen to our recording, you will hear it, where they were actually saying there's a need to rationalize and cut. There's a need to merge. Now, we're all for more efficiency and so forth, but we have to be careful how we're looking at this issue within the UN system. Are we silencing this? When we talk about issues of funding, is the anti-racism agenda getting adequate funding? And the answer overwhelmingly is no. Even when I worked within the system, that was the case, right? You had no funding to do this work, and we still have very little funding. And it's amazing that we've been able to do so much with almost a zero budget. Nothing. We meet once a year for 4 years. That's it. That's what the budget provides. And I think it provides for 2 staff. That's it. And so still we have been able to move forward and push, particularly gender and reparations, so much. Our session last year looked at restitution and reparations for Haiti. That was very well received, and I think a lot of solid recommendations came out of that. And shortly thereafter, we're hearing France making some overtures as about wanting to set up a committee to look at these issues, to extent to look at how we can deal with issue of restitution. The extent to which that will happen is something else. And I know he mentioned it, the president mentioned it again during the Ghana meeting, but we will say that the UN spaces, particularly the Permanent Forum, has allowed for this discussion of reparatory justice. And we must ensure that we can be sustained and even grow to strength and not be cut as a forum to move this process forward. It is important. I would say, ally, if you will, to advancing the work that's happening in the next steps agenda for the Ghana resolution. So the UN should not be forgotten in this process. It's an important part of the space. A lot of work has been done, and we should see how we can advance it even further and build on it.
Very, very important. I do want to bring in our colleague here from Ghana, because I want to get his take on it. Now, one of the things that I was really taken aback, and forgive me for saying this, I hope it would not come across in again, I have to be mindful of language as well. But when I visited Ghana, it honestly broke my heart that the people in the neighborhoods of whether that was in the Cape Coast, in the Cape Coast Castle, and you ask them about what the enslavement, the human trafficking castles that were there, the dungeons that I visited, and folks were just, I'm talking now about the ordinary man on the street. Oh, that history. It just, to me, the impression that I got, and that was just on the regular man on the street. Obviously, if you're knowledgeable about that history, perhaps you have a different take on it. But that broke my heart a bit there. But let us talk about, in the context of the continent, the challenges when conversations about reparations come up, and what do you see, for example, the AU doing, for example, to overcome those challenges? That some of those are structural as well, in terms of finance, that
Yeah.
you've also spoken about.
It's great observation. Because one of the biggest struggles that we are dealing with, which for me I think is also intentional, is the lack of political education. Right? The fact that most Ghanaians and most Africans in general do not have a deep political understanding of colonialism, of enslavement, of what was happening in the Caribbean, the consequences of it, and vice versa. Right? When I'm in the Caribbean, when I'm in Grenada or elsewhere, sometimes when I talk to young people, they don't have a fuller understanding. People don't even know who Kwame Nkrumah is. Right? It's like, so there has to be a deep political consciousness of educating one another, of educating Africans. And that is one of the things that we have to first and foremost deal with. Otherwise, when you go to Ghana, you still have these Africans, these Ghanaians who are there not having that consciousness of what the castle symbolized, right? A symbol of exploitation. And the other thing too that I think is very critical for us to also note is some of the attempts. I mean, I have an article that I wrote a couple of years ago about the United Nations Africa Institute for Economic Development and Planning, where you had a number of African economists alongside Caribbean and Latin American economists who came to Senegal to understand a simple question: why is Africa still underdeveloped? And that we have to move beyond the UN framework of economic development, which they were arguing that development was something that was detached from exploitation, detached from colonialism, right? But these scholars began to raise consciousness, and in their work foreground, specifically working alongside people like Walter Rodney and his important work, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, systematically showing, because we do know that there is systematic accumulation of wealth. But when it comes to the study of systematic exploitation and destruction of wealth, we do not pay equal attention to that. So the work that the AU is doing is to bring attention specifically to the impact of colonialism and how colonialism, as well as institutions such as the IMF, such as the World Bank, might have good intentions, but are also furthering the exploitation of Africa. When African countries or Caribbean countries go up for loans, they get a much higher interest than other Western loans, other Western countries. We even saw with the Marshall Plan, when they were trying to rebuild Europe, Europe got free money, billions of money was given. But then when it comes to Africa, significant loans, we're being told that we cannot fund our education system. Part of structural adjustment was we cannot fund research. And we know that every major developed country, quote unquote, one of the drivers is research. But when it comes to Africa, you cannot hire doctors, you cannot hire nurses, you cannot fund higher education. All these things that will put us on par with advanced countries is something that we really have to reflect on and see how we can bring attention to those. And that is what the AU is trying to do. And also trying to think about the infrastructures that we can put in place to ensure that we are getting concrete actions. But financing is very, very critical. Financing for Africa, we need African countries to really seriously commit resources to undertaking some of these projects, and also bringing attention to some of the inter-country relationship. We've seen what is going on in South Africa with xenophobia. Right? We have to bring attention to these things, because the real mechanisms of exploitation are not these Black African immigrants, but the fact that economic apparatus and systems are still in the hands of white South Africans. Right? So these are the things that I think it is very important to bring attention to, and that is what the AU is also pushing forward.
Very, very important. Let me see if I can bring back Dr. Suma here. Dr. Suma, it looks like you're also having some internet issues there. So we will get to you once you're able to turn your camera back on and once that connection issue is fixed. But I do want to just follow up on what you just articulated here. Let us talk about, in the context of Africa, we always hear that the continent, some of the countries in the continent have some of the fastest growing economies in the world. And this is a curiosity I have. This is an off-the-cuff follow-up here. How can you and perhaps others in the space engage with some of the Africans in the African private sector to support initiatives like this?
So, I mean, first of all, I think we really, when we hear 7 out of, 2013, it was reported that 7 out of the 10 fastest growing economies were in Africa, which was true. But we have to then interrogate some of these things, because you take Ghana, for example, the Asante Gold is not necessarily, Ghana owns about 2%, right? When foreigners come, they're staying in Airbnbs, hotels that are not owned by Ghanaians, are owned by Europeans. Right? So how do we ensure that there is money in the system, that we are not being caught up by these fancy economic terms around high growth economic development when the regular folks in Ghana are really struggling? I mean, the year of return was a great initiative for Ghana, but at the same time, it has made it very, very expensive for local Ghanaians to celebrate Christmas in their own country. Now, there's even, I will argue that there are 3 different Ghanaians that exist. There's the Ghanaian of the elite, there's the Ghanaian of the diaspora, and your regular folks. So how can we build a more equitable society so that everybody is able to participate in the world that is circulating? You talk to Uber drivers, they're barely making ends meet because all the money goes back to Uber. So these are some of the conversations that we are thinking about. But how do we build economic relationships that are stronger? So when Caribbean folks come in, how do we ensure that they are partnering with African-owned businesses, right? And not necessarily European businesses that are still taking money out of the country. So I think identifying and diagnosing the problem more effectively allows us to build stronger infrastructures and solidarities that will actually lead to benefits for both Caribbeans as well as Africans on the continent.
Neoliberalism is also colonialism, right? So
yes.
When I hear I think colonization as well. It's important to note that, and it's important to note where the profits are going.
Yes.
Right? Again, it follows a similar pattern. It leaves Africa, it goes to the colonizing entities, right?
Because
so I think that's an important.
Sorry, I was going to say,
you go ahead, please.
Most of the tourist money are spent on the flights that are coming. I mean, right now, flights from just New York to Ghana, about 10 hours, you are now getting one luggage, and people are paying over $2,000. So, and when you get to Ghana, people are staying in Airbnbs that are not owned by Ghanaians, but mostly Europeans. The phone services that they use and internet are owned by European companies. The Ubers are owned by. So as much as tourism is helpful and is coming, the money does not get to the ordinary Ghanaians. So having a sense of this, how then do we think about how do we create airlines that ensures that the money are coming to the people? How do we ensure that the hotels, the accommodations that the people are staying in are owned by Ghanaians? That the services, the taxi services are owned by Ghanaians. These are practical ways that we can ensure economic freedom.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Suma, if I can bring you in now, your connection seems to have stabilized here. In respect of a lot of the work that the CARICOM Reparations Commission has done, and looking forward to the second decade, how can the Reparations Commission in CARICOM and the individual island reparations committees, we know, for example, in Grenada, our reparations committee chair, Mr. Ali Gill, they've been doing a lot of work, in respect of bringing attention to those concerns, but then you also get that pushback. So how can the second decade assist in those efforts to getting us to fill those gaps? Yes.
Okay, I would like to I heard both of the presenters, although I was not online.
Yes.
I want to speak to the issues that Gaynell spoke to at the UN.
Yes.
And also to what Professor also spoke to with regard to the fact that we are not getting the fruits of.
It looks like, yes, again, we having the island internet can be a challenge everywhere, and every island you go to. I think in Ghana it's the same issue. Sometimes, let's see if we get her back again. But we will. So what we will do right now, actually, I think this will be a very important point for us to take a break. So we will take a quick break, and we'll come back with the conversation.
Said that the second decade must be dedicated to issues pertaining to reparation. The Permanent Forum has said that the second decade must be dedicated to issues pertaining to reparations, issues pertaining to deconstructing and undoing the systemic anti-Black racism that is embedded in the international arena and in national societies around the world, and indeed to declaration on the promotion, protection, and full respect for the rights of people of African descent.
Dufusky Island, South Carolina. Men, women, and children were brought here from Africa. Their responsibility to work on plantations growing indigo, rice, and cotton, turning a profit for their owners. But all that changed in 1861 when the Civil War broke out largely over slavery, pitting states in the South against those in the North. Slaves fought in the war and eventually became free, with a promise to land and education when the conflict ended in 1865. More than 1,000 freed slaves settled here on Dufusky Island, but only 13 descendants of slaves occupy the island today. They're struggling to uphold their rights to inherited land that is now prime real estate. This phenomenon began in the early 1980s, when landowners witnessed a spike in property taxes as resorts and golf courses took over, driving up land values.
There must be a way that they could address people who have always had their land, no fault of their own, been impacted by development.
While in 4th grade, attending the local elementary school, he met Dr. J. Herman Blake, a visiting professor. Together with Dr. Blake, who is currently the executive director of the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor Commission, Irvin helps people to resolve land issues. The commission assists the descendants of slaves who settled in South Carolina, the Gullah, and those residing in Georgia, the Geechee, to retain precious land left by their ancestors and at the same time preserve their culture. To ensure the rights of people of African descent, such as the Gullah Geechee, are protected, their contributions recognized, and their rich cultural heritage preserved, the United Nations has declared an International Decade for People of African Descent.
Very important reflection. Very important reflection there. So we want to get back to Dr. Suma. Dr. Suma, I hope the internet will cooperate.
Maybe I should continue on my phone because
yes, please do that. Yes, please continue on your phone here. Yes.
Okay.
I think it will be more efficient. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much.
No problem.
I wanted to say that the United Nations is very important in relation to the structural changes that we want to see. Both
Yes.
both the speakers spoke to the issue of the extraction that has continued. So colonialism has not ended, extraction continues. So when you see the new plantations being created, whether they be tourism, whether they be financial services, etc., all these one crop plantations that continue to exploit us, they will continue to happen until we change the structure. And the only way we can change the structure right now is through the United Nations. The United Nations is key to changing these structures so that people that we were just watching, the Gullah people, you know, people whose cultures have been stolen, like the return of cultural artifacts and cultural heritage is very critical to reparatory justice. They sit in museums. What is the United Nations saying on that? Yes, but is there an enforcement of these things? So they're telling us that they are better placed to be able to take care of our heritage that they have extracted. And I'm saying that it is important for us to tackle at the structural level. The United Nations itself needs to go through that structural shift. Gaynell spoke to the issue of the Security Council. Why is it we are not represented at that level? So I'm saying that the United Nations is fundamental to some of the changes. The United Nations is fundamental to the decolonization of the region. Since the 1960s, we have established the C24 to look at decolonization and further decolonization. And we have not enforced that at the level of the United Nations. It is important for us to continue with the decolonization process. So all of these issues are very, very important for us to then take up at the United Nations. And the Permanent Forum is in a position because it serves as an advisory body on these humanitarian issues, which of course transform into cultural, social, and political and economic issues, for us to be able to ensure that we do not continue to see this exploitation. Why should the French-speaking countries on the continent be paying taxes? Why are we paying more in interest to the IMF and the World Bank when the money that they're lending to us is our own money? These are the transformational issues that the second decade must ensure that we tackle. And in the second year already of the second decade, we have not spoken to these things at the UN, and it means that we'll be running behind and trying to catch up again in the second decade. I'm not saying that to say that things will not happen in the second decade, but we have to stop looking and stop talking. We have to put things in place to make sure that there is transformation. And we ourselves must undertake the education programs. One of the reasons why these things have not happened in Africa, and you were so hurt by what the African people said near to these prisons, not castles, these prisons, these internment camps. One of the reasons is because we have not undertaken the education. Africa was afraid because people said they were complicit. They tell you that Africans were complicit in selling their brothers and sisters, and some of us have bought into that, when they have not told you that there were many wars fought against enslavement on the continent. They have not told you about the diplomatic missions that went to Europe to ask them to stop the trafficking. They will not tell you these things because they want us to blame ourselves. So the education program is very, very important with regard to reparatory justice and the internal healing that we need to do, so that we do not continue to look at the industries that they bring into our countries and not see them as extraction, of the continued resources and the new resources that we are building in our countries. So I want to make that very clear.
Yes, and that's a very important point. And I do want to bring in the rest of the panel here to speak to this question, because again, to me, that is misinformation in the context of saying that, well, and this is what the colonizers are using now to say, well, they sold you all anyways. So why are you calling for reparations? Shouldn't you be calling for Africans to give you Caribbean people reparations, right? But and I want you to elaborate, please, Dr. Curry and Dr. Gam from the continent, on this question of again using this narrative of again the internecine conflicts that existed between different tribes in Africa, which was different from a system of chattel slavery. So I think it's important for that distinction to be made. And the idea that Africans knowingly sold people into a system of chattel slavery, that is inaccurate. So please elaborate on that, please. Dr. Gay, if you can just unmute your mic, sir, please. Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, go ahead now. Yes, no problem. Go ahead now, please.
We have to ask ourselves one fundamental question as to who benefits when we ask
Follow
this.
the money.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Because if Africans sold each other, as simplistic as we are trying to put forth, then where are all the great mansions?
That's the wealth.
The insurance companies from Liverpool, right? Because we ask ourselves, how did certain banking system develop in the Dutch? Linked to the slave trade. How did certain insurance emerge in Liverpool and other places linked to the slave trade, right? So how even the acquisition of certain wealth, because we do know that enslaved Africans had the ability to hold their breath underwater for a long time. So when ships carrying gold sank, they used their skills to get the money, and that money their what you call it, owners took it and for their own wealth, right? So we have to follow the money as the question is being taught, and we also have to have a more complex understanding of the African society. The notion that a group of people who are Africans assumes, that people are all one and not pay attention to differences. In my department, you have people teaching French history, English history, Ireland history, but then African history. It's just one. Right? You can have in the Department of History, you can have about 7 people teaching U.S. history. But then when it comes to Africa, and those things perpetuates this idea of African as one, we allow Europe to see the differences. Oh, these people are French. Oh, these people are English. Oh, these people are Irish. Right? But when it comes to Africa, once again, we do not allow Africans to also express a level of difference. And this whole idea of the slave trade too is very complex. I mean, in Africa, there were systems whereby enslaved Africans, even the term slave sometimes takes away the deep nuances because there are different terms. When you use the word slave, it covers everything. But on the African continent, there are different, it means different terms. But this is what happens when translation is also lost. Because some of
deliberately.
It's very deliberate. Yeah.
Some of these enslaved Africans became part of the family and rose through ranks. Right? Yeah. In the new world, it's not working like that. Right? We see Africans being demonized. The demonization of Black people, of Africans, is foundational to the making of the modern world. It's foundational to the modern of the academy. Because even the humanities, the study of humans, excluded Black people. These are all the things that displace Africans. When it comes to African rights, we don't want to talk about it. But when it comes to other group of people who have experienced genocide, oh, let us talk about that. Let us allocate funding. Right? So we have to understand these complexities on the ground. And as Ambassador you also pointed out, Africans were at the forefront of also pushing and fighting against some of these enslavement. Because even the way that they teach about the Haitian Revolution, it was like, oh yeah, these people were just there, and one day they saw what's happening in France, and they became motivated to also try to demand their own freedom, depriving Haitians themselves, knowing that we want to be free. It's not because we saw a white man trying to fight for something. No. So this is one of the things that I want to bring forth to foreground and move beyond these simplistic narratives.
Yes, absolutely. Anyone else wants to chime in? Yes.
I would want to jump in here because I think that,
yes,
what is clear, and I'm hoping that this is priority in this decade, the need to decolonize our education, because we have this, the same way Africans were not taught about the diaspora and the enslavement of its people and what was going on in the Americas, we were not taught about the Africans. And we were not taught that there were great African kingdoms, because what we saw on television, quote unquote, that's all we were seeing, is people running around naked in the bush. And so this perception that Africa is this dark, as June said, dark continent, there's ignorance there, there's not enough, we have to take a hold of the narrative, because they control the narrative for far too long, and they tell us what we are to think. And they start indoctrinating us when we're in the cradle. What we're learning in nursery rhymes, are their nursery rhymes. They tell us what is good, what is bad. And we learned about London bridges falling down, but we never learned one thing about a great African kingdom, right? You didn't know any of this. So I think education is going to be crucial in this process. In education, yes, about reparatory justice, but education about who we are as a people, education about Africa, education about the Caribbean, education about where we are across these Americas and where we are in the world, in the diaspora, generally speaking. The challenge that I have, and this same idea that we use, different words to describe the same thing, or the same words to describe different things. You go in, when we were in Brazil, for an example, we'll hear that blacks are referred to like in 30 different words, 30 different ways. How do we ensure that we have a comprehensive way to deal with it? How do we know what we're talking about, right? So I think we really need to focus on education and decolonizing our education, what we teach our children in schools, what we learn at university. Even at the University of the Bahamas, I'm constantly having this battle, right? And saying that, what we need to be focused on is more about who we are. I would love to see more on African history, African literature. It's not there, right? And so the more we get to know about each other and the realities, and that will happen as we open up. We talk about the removal of visas, and we have that. We talk about more flights. We talk also about having more embassies. We don't have an embassy on the continent. Right? So we don't have a way to show who we are. We know from our engagement with Ghana that a lot of our practices here in the Bahamas are actually steeply rooted in Ghanaian culture. Our Jonkanu, which is our biggest festival, is a Ghanaian, has a Ghanaian origin. So, but we don't know that. So we have to, because we think everything about Africa is bad. There's nothing good about Africa. We have to rethink this whole process. And education is a key. Decolonization of the education across the board, from kindergarten all the way to university.
I'm so glad you made that point, because I would just share a quick anecdote. I remember when I visited Ghana, there is a practice that we do in the Caribbean when we suck our teeth. Ghanaians do that as well, right? Ghanaians have the hibiscus drink. We call it sorrel.
Yes.
The way that sometimes Ghanaians do that with their mouth, right? We do that in the Caribbean as well. It just, once you land in Ghana, I remember the first time I landed in Ghana, I was like, wow, this is Grenada. This feels like Grenada. And so the point is, I also think there was a cultural genocide in a sense. In other
Yes.
words, there's so many things, that so many nonverbal cues, for example, that we practice in the Caribbean, that is in fact ancestral. But there is no
Yes.
way, there is no framework for us to have
Mhm.
an appreciation that the connections are there. So I think that
Yeah.
is why that education is so absolutely critical and important. But Dr. Suma, I want you to add, if you wanted
Yes.
to add anything here.
Oh
Lots.
yes, and for me, what came to mind as you all were speaking is the Creole language.
Oh yeah.
In Saint Lucia, in Grenada, in Martinique, in Guadeloupe, etc., we speak a
Haiti.
Creole language that many people see as broken English or as broken French and so on. But it's a unique language. It was part of how we built our resilience. It's a resilience language. They couldn't understand what we were saying because we developed a new language. And that is the innovation you see coming through our resilience and from the oppression that we suffered. One of the points that I wanted to make that we never seem to make, well, 2 points. One is the issue of genocide. We speak to the issue of genocide of the native people, but we never speak to the cruelty of the enslavement that also created genocide. In the Caribbean, in the English-speaking Caribbean alone, I know that there were 12 million people, or 12.5, and they still cannot decide on the number of people who came across from Africa who were trafficked across the Atlantic. But in the English-speaking Caribbean, for example, there were almost 3 million alone. And at emancipation, only 800,000. What happened to the others? What happened to the others if you cannot call it genocide?
Yeah.
So you see genocide, I mean, the whole criminal system was built on genocide and extraction. So I want us to take note of that. The other thing I want us to take note of is because very recently, the French government, Macron, repealed the Code Noir. The Code Noir was the second set of slave laws that were established after the 1661 Barbados Act, which made us chattel. Do you know that the 1661 Act that made us chattel has never been repealed? So in their eyes, we are still chattel. We are still enslaved people. We are still 3/4 of a human being. These are the things we are fighting against. We are not just fighting against these little technical things. We are fighting against an ideology that says that we are inferior. And that is why it is very important what Gainel said about education. Because we have to speak historical truth.
Yes.
We have to speak historical truth. We must prevent ourselves from being erased, because that is the pushback that we are seeing now, according to Mia Motley, with the asinine responses that they are giving to us, you know, about we have to pay them for civilizing us and all of these issues. I am telling you that we have to take control of our narrative, which is why the language we use is so important, which is why education is so important, which is why cultural recognition is so important in the second decade. And advancing recognition is so fundamental to reparatory justice and to the second decade. So I want us to make that point. And then we must make the point about underdevelopment.
Yes.
Because the aim is to continue to underdevelop us. Since the 1980s at the UN, there has been a framework for development and the right to development, which they do not apply to us. The right to development must apply to us. And we can only have that development. We can only have that sustainable development if we have reparatory justice.
Yes.
That is the only way we can get ourselves out of the situation. And that is why they're fighting reparatory justice, because they know that we will use it to create generational wealth. And the intergenerational structuring that we need to put in place for the success of Africans and people of African descent. That is why they are pushing back, because for more than 4 centuries, they have owned our resources, and now their own economies are on the verge of collapse. What have they done if all what they have extracted from us?
We at this point we are going to take. Yes, go ahead, Professor, and then we'll get some questions in.
I
from
just
the
wanted, in
audience.
terms of back to the education aspect. So I have a book that I just completed. Hopefully, it will come out soon. But in the book, I talk about this particular chief. His name is Nana Kwabena Ketia, the fourth, and he worked with Nkrumah. He was put in prison with Nkrumah during Ghana's independence, during Ghana's struggle for independence. Excuse me. And later, he traveled through Latin America and the Caribbean, working for UNESCO to organize a conference between Africa and Latin America. And he was a chief, and his grandfather was a chief as well. And when he got to places like Suriname, for example, he began to hear certain sounds, certain drumming sounds. He ate certain foods that his grandfather had taught him, but were no longer in existence in Ghana.
Oh,
But
wow.
in the Caribbean, in Latin America, he's finding these things, and he's rethinking what culture means. Because most of the time we think about Africa as this important cultural space, which is true, but also we have to think about the ways in which the Caribbean becomes an incubator, an incubation of certain African cultural practices that no
Yes.
longer exist in colonized Africa. Right? And that's the point that I wanted to make, that it is therefore critical that we study these cultural practices on both sides of the Atlantic.
Yes.
Very important point. So we want to get some viewer questions here. We have a question here, and that's a question concerning the UN, the United Nations. Anne-Lee is asking again, why should we trust or work with the United Nations in the context of doing a lot of the work that we need to do on decolonizing systems, decolonizing thinking, and really treating with, again, the second decade is a UN-sponsored event. So if you can speak to that, please.
Yeah, I'll start and maybe others can jump in. But
Yes.
what I always say, if there wasn't a UN, I think we'd have to create one. This is a coming together of all countries of the world. And while it is not perfect, it's far from that. It is an opportunity for us to come together, to engage, to discuss, to talk about how we can improve things. I think disengaging will be a discredit to us. We have an opportunity, and I think the resolution led by Ghana the other day showed that we have an opportunity for a geopolitical shift where countries in the global south are now having this voice, and they're using it collectively to make certain decisions moving forward. And I think the next steps agenda, what we do with that resolution and how we take this forward, is going to be crucial. I often say that what is happening to us in terms of the defunding of certain issues and the cutting of certain agendas, maybe it's an opportunity for us to rethink who our partners ought to be. Right? Perhaps we need to be looking more at Africa, more at our brothers and sisters in Latin America. We don't always have to have the same partners. We don't always it's an opportunity for us to think differently and strategically within the context of the UN. It's an opportunity for us to reshape the UN. We have the large majority of votes in the General Assembly. The General Assembly is where the budget is agreed. So at the end of the day, we have control of the budget. What we have to do is come together and ensure that there's this not this divide and conquer that happens all the time within the UN system, where they come to us individually and pluck us off away from each other. We have the capacity to use this organization and shape it to what we want it to be. And shape it so it is more beneficial to us in the development context. I would say that, again, if the UN didn't exist, for me, I'd want to see it created because it's an opportunity for us. We have to take it and take advantage of this shift, the geopolitical shift that's happening right now, where we talked about the largest number of the fastest economies are in Africa. Also, the youngest populations are in Africa. And so I'm saying we need to take advantage of these things and to see how we can shape this to benefit us. One of the things we didn't talk about, I don't talk about it too often. I'm a UN person. I grew up in the UN as a UN staffer, but we cannot afford to separate ourselves. What we need to do is ensure that our people are in the UN so that we have a say. And I was in board meetings, in committee meetings, where they would talk about funding certain things. One of it was a project in Grenada. And I said, why not Grenada? Why not? Why should they not be funded for their project that they want to do? So we have to have people at the table, around the table, driving the agenda. We cannot afford to step away. We need to ensure that I hope that our governments would support us in these spaces. I think it's so crucial that June and I are here, that Varian is in CERT, that we have Barbara in the working group. We need to be around the table because we help shape the agenda. CARICOM and having us at the table helped shape that resolution that Ghana led, helped shape it to what needed to be in there. I insisted that we have something on gendered, what we speak of gendered reparations in there. So to say that why should we be there? Because this is how we can shape the agenda. And I think that the Caribbean has the capacity. We have been doing it. We've been punching well beyond our weight, above our weight. And I think we can continue to do that. We have some strong leaders in the region that I think that is important for us to continue important that they continue to lead us in terms of these issues around reparations and anti-Black discrimination, anti-discrimination generally, but we need to ensure that we bring the population along, and that comes through education and awareness of the population. I can't hear.
Yes, one final question that we would take. Does the Decades Work account for public education programming within its current mandate? And you touched on it here, but let us talk about that. And I want to get all of your takes on it. Public education.
Public education is really very important. Governments do not want to move ahead with either the issues related to the second decade because the United Nations is just putting in place the various parameters for the second decade. They have appointed an ambassador to do that, to report back to them, and he should be reporting back to them. We had a meeting with him, Gaynell and myself, at the United Nations Permanent Forum session in Geneva this year. And we have made some things very clear that they should extend beyond just recognition, justice, and development to look at issues related to participation and monitoring and evaluation and issues like that, and financing that we have already spoken to. And we don't want a situation where governments are moving ahead and their citizens are not following behind them. Public education will be very important. The importance of civil society to this process cannot be overstated. The Permanent Forum is in this position and has advanced so much in the last 3 years because we have a civil society network attached to us.
Yep.
And they have monthly meetings and they push our agenda. We need our Caribbean people. We need people in Africa to also advocate on our behalf. But they cannot advocate if they don't know what we are fighting for and why we are fighting for what we are fighting for. So public education is very important. And so we have to put a lot of our financing. Gaynell and I do these things without being paid to do them because we recognize the importance of public education and public consultation. And I wish the governments would then step in and say, okay, let us support our two people on the Permanent Forum to go around the Caribbean and make sure that they engage in the public education program that is necessary. We were chosen on this body because of who we are and what the work that we do. You know, we were chosen on the African Union Committee of Experts because of the work that the Permanent Forum does, because of the work that CARICOM does. But we need our people. We cannot let it just be a government-led process, that everybody must be involved in ensuring that our people can advocate on our behalf. In the United Kingdom, for example, with the things that have been said recently about removing visas from us because of the fact that we are asking for reparatory justice. We are asking for justice, and how can you make a statement like that? You know, justice is justice, so justice does not apply to us as people of African descent. And we need our people to be able to advocate, but they cannot advocate if we don't do the public education. So I'm saying that it's a very, very necessary step, and we must do the same thing on the continent. We would be very happy to share our processes on the continent and to move around to do the kind of education that is necessary for governments to have the backing of their people.
Professor from Ghana?
So, I mean, I definitely agree with what my esteemed panelists have said. Like the Black intellectual Stokely Carmichael said, the job of the conscious is to make the unconscious conscious. And it is very imperative that we go around raising the consciousness of our people, educating them why certain things are the way that they are. Recently, there was a massive flooding in Ghana. We have to understand what is causing these climate changes. It's like Africa and the Caribbeans are suffering at the hands of the pollution that is also coming from the West. Right? Environmental justice, we have to bring attention to it. Public education is critical. Why is it that we don't learn about each other, the Caribbean and Africa? These are questions that we have to really push forward. Why is it that we're being taught to hate ourselves? I mean, in Ghana, if you're going to church, there's an old saying that if you're going to church and you see a white man, you should turn back and go home because you have seen God, right? We should to ask ourselves, why are we internalizing these things? So public education, as we saw what happened in Grenada during the revolution, public education was critical. During Nkrumah's 10-year, public education was very, very important in raising people's consciousness. So I will echo what everything that has been said, that we have to emancipate ourselves from anti-slavery. And the only way to do that is to ensure that our public education is sound.
Very well, very, very important. And this effort here is also part of that public education.
Yes.
You know, and we will take one final question from Martin Felix. He's saying, since it's universally recognized that wherever Africans and people of African descent live, they're subjected to human rights violation and discrimination. Therefore, would there be something tantamount to a Black human rights charter that would emerge at the end of the second decade?
Janelle, you can take that, the declaration.
Yes, very much so. We are in the process of elaborating a declaration on the human rights of people of African descent. Now, we're in tough negotiations. I was just speaking with, the chief negotiator on that and bringing in some thoughts. We have had as a permanent forum several consultations in Barbados, Brazil, Colombia, and Canada. So far, we're hoping to go to Europe also to have consultations. And these regional consultations have brought us, we've heard from civil society what they would want to see in this declaration. We see this declaration as an important tool for us to ensure it's being shaped. It's a declaration for the human rights of people of African descent. It is for us specifically, right? It isn't talking about the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which looks at racial discrimination as a broader issue, but we're speaking specifically about people of African descent and the issues that are of concern to us. And we are ensuring, we are really negotiating hard to ensure that those issues that were brought to our attention as we had our consultations with civil society, that they are introduced in that. There's a lot of pushback, but I will tell you that there has been a lot of support and encouragement to have our voices in this. As I said to them in Geneva in the negotiation, you cannot have a resolution or declaration developed for us, without our voices, right? And so I'm telling you, not just what the 10 of us around the table say at the permanent forum as expert members of the forum, but I'm telling you what the hundreds of people of African descent have said to it, thousands, in all those spaces that we met and we've had conversations about these issues. So it's important. We will have this declaration. Now, we know the direct declaration and the international law is not legally binding per se, but we know that it's a first step in getting a legally binding instrument that will be specific to us, which is why it is so important that we, as much as possible, if you want to, you can also write to us, share your ideas, tell us what you would want to see in that declaration so that we can ensure that as far as possible, we have something that can really advance the human rights, lives, and livelihoods of people of African descent. Just this cannot, this to me is really the next step for us to have this document in place, to have this declaration in place, and then for us to lobby even further, to work even harder to ensure that it becomes, and it can become that, it can become a legally binding instrument. It can do that. We saw that Ghana just got 122 countries to agree on a resolution. So we can have something that is for us. And so, yes, I see this being a very important text for us. It's an important part of our mandate as a permanent forum to ensure that this happens, that we're actively involved in the process. And I have been engaged in that really significantly over the last year, I would say. And we've had other colleagues involved as well. Our colleague from Colombia, Pastor, has been very much pushing on this issue to ensure that we have really matters that are of concern and that this declaration reflects and looks like us. And it's not a declaration that is elaborated by Europeans and others that are not necessarily having our best interests at heart.
Absolutely. Very, very important forum today. I think we need more of this. And it was indeed that there were so many other issues that we needed to get to. But I do want us to get to closing comments. And whoever wants to, I would begin with you, Dr. Sumer in St. Lucia.
Yes, thank you, because my internet keeps falling.
Yes.
So I think it's because we are having rain. But
yes.
I just want to say thank you very much. This is my third engagement on the second decade. The first was in Trinidad, then the Bahamas, and now Grenada. And so as we proceed with ensuring that the things that we want to see happen for the second decade, we want people to be able to speak on these issues. This is not simply about the United Nations bodies. This is not simply about the governments. The UN Permanent Forum gives you a voice. We have, for the first time this year, we had a number of people from the Caribbean at the United Nations Permanent Forum meeting in Geneva. A lot of our young people, the young ambassadors, the youth ambassadors were there. We have been doing a lot of work on the ground. In St. Lucia, we recently debated the issue of reparatory justice amongst the youth parliamentarians, both in the parliament and in the Senate. The same thing was done in St. Kitts and in Nevis. We have to get our young people involved in the conversation. And so I'm saying thank you so much that you have put this out there so I can make these recommendations so that Grenada itself and the rest of the Caribbean can come on board. The CARICOM Reparations Committee, which I'm also a part of, is now in England, speaking to the parliament, speaking to the people, speaking to the ambassadors. We want all of these processes to meet and for us to be in the same space, the same thought space, for us to know what we are advancing, why we are advancing reparatory justice as a developmental model for the Caribbean, and how we can ensure that we are building generational wealth. And I just don't mean wealth in terms of cash. I mean wealth in terms of knowledge, wealth in terms of culture. You know, how we are consolidating these things so that we shape and forge our own identity as people of African descent and as Africans. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Ms. Curry.
Yes. Just to say my thanks. I think it's awesome that you had this. When I first heard that you wanted to do something in Ghana and in Grenada, I discussed it further in Ghana and to see how we can get to do this kind of work in the Caribbean. June and I have been talking about doing this across the Caribbean. and going to all of the Caribbean countries to really discuss what the second decade means to us, why it is important, and as you know, I'm happy to say I'm happy that you're doing it virtually as well, because I want, you know, while we would love to travel to all the beautiful countries throughout the Caribbean, we're also happy to meet you online and to have that conversation, because I think the conversation is necessary. It has to be had. And I'm particularly happy that we have our Ghanaian brother on the call as well, bringing a different perspective and showing how we need to make those links. I, as the chair of the Permanent Forum, I'm particularly pleased to be here and to be a part of this process, and say that the Permanent Forum is your forum. It is a permanent forum for people of African descent, and it's on people of African descent. And many of us are working to ensure that it's something that you can really gain from. So I want to open up once again that invitation to all of you online to say, please join us at our next session, which is going to be in Addis, we're hoping. As soon as we have dates, we will publish that. Go online and check us out. We're online at PFPAD, at the United Nations, UN Permanent Forum of People of Africans. Find out who we are and what we're doing. The second decade is important to us. It is one of our primary aspects of our mandate. So we want to continue to discuss. So tell others that you know we're here. We're ready to work with you, to collaborate with you, and to have these discussions. These very, very important discussions across the Caribbean. I will say, June mentioned about development. I feel that, and reparations, I feel that there can be no real development without reparations. And I always say that there cannot be any real discussion about reparations. And I feel compelled always to say it. No real reparations without centering our brothers and sisters from Haiti. So I'm happy to have had this opportunity, and I want to wish Grenada all the best in this decade as you do your excellent work on advancing the human rights, lives, and livelihoods of people of African descent in your beautiful country. Thank you.
Absolutely. And our brother from Ghana, last word to you, sir, my brother.
First, I'll be brief, but first of all, this is great. I'm very happy to have been in conversation with all of y'all to do this important work that has a long tradition of centering the lived experience of African peoples globally. And I think it is very important that we try to build these connections with those our brothers and sisters across the Atlantic, and also instilling in our communities this awareness and this curiosity to learn about one another. And knowing that for me, I have a book coming out, the central question is what happens to anti-colonial ideas when an anti-colonial government falls. And I look right after Nkrumah's overthrow and seeing these Ghanaian intellectuals who found themselves in the Caribbean, in the US, partnering with the revolutionary fervor at that time in Grenada, Guyana, and elsewhere. It is important that we build solidarity, we learn our histories to try to carefully and correctly diagnose the global imperialist system that seeks to oppress us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, panel, for this very important public forum today on just looking forward to the second decade and the work that's ahead. The work that's ahead is very important work. And so for those of you who are on the sidelines, this is also a call to action for you to come forward and get involved in the work, because we cannot accomplish any of those things without public support from our Grenadian and Caribbean brothers and sisters to ensure that we can get that work done, because solidarity would not be possible without boots on the ground, if you will. Let's see here. One final comment. Great panel and conversation. Big up, Dr. Summer. And I read your essay on cricket. Big up, Dr. Yamfi. Met you at CSA, and big up Ambassador Curry, repping my birthplace, Bahamas, the Bahamas. So we have a viewer there just shouting you all out. So panel, once again, thank you for participating in today's public forum.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Viewers and listeners, this brings this very important and seminal public forum on the UN second decade of people of African descent, and a range of issues we were able to treat with respect to the work that needs to be done for the second decade for people of African descent all over in the motherland, as well as in the diaspora, as well in the African diaspora as well. So we want to thank you for participating. For those of you who left questions and comments, we also want to thank you for participating in today's public forum. Of course, the Bubb Report will be returning for its regular scheduled programming. But before I do that, Ambassador Gill from Grenada, Mr. Ali Gill, who is the chair of the Grenada Reparations Committee, he has expressed apologies for not being able to be here, as he was having some internet connectivity issues as well. But he does send his regards and his solidarity for today's forum as well. So we just thought that we needed to make that point. But on behalf of the producers and the folks in the Grenada National Reparations Committee, Tesra Peterson, Dr. Tesra Peterson, Peter and Twine, and everyone who helped us to facilitate today's public forum, we say thanks for participating. And the Bubb Report will return for its regularly scheduled program this coming Sunday at 10 a.m. We promise to have former Prime Minister Dr. Ralph Gonsalves on the program, who will be speaking to issues of reparations. He just got back from Ghana, I believe, and he'll be giving us an update on that, as well as an update on other issues relative to what's happening on the reparations front. So we'll see you next week again for the resumption of the Bubb Report this coming Sunday. And take care. Have a good one. Bye-bye. Hi, everyone. The Bubb Report is committed to being fearless, balanced, and independent, bringing you the stories that matter most without compromise. Now do us a favor. Remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit the bell so you never miss an update. You can also watch us on GBN TV every Wednesday at 5 p.m. Catch us on WPG10 television every Sunday at 8 p.m. Your support helps us to keep journalism free from bias and influence. And together, we can make sure every voice is heard and every fact is verified. Thanks for watching.